afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I have with me Dr. Judy Wood. And just for this show, we are filling in for Diana Spingola, who is otherwise engaged at this present time. And so you have us for the 3 hours, the next 3 hours, with all the breaks, of course. And I apologise if this show appears to be a little bit haphazard. I've wanted to spend more time doing some preparation, but I think nevertheless we are going to have some interesting topics to discuss, and hopefully some thought-provoking information for you to consider and digest, and hopefully go off and study after the programme. And you can visit my website, which is checktheevidence.com, and you can visit Dr. Judy Wood's website, which is drjudywood.com, which can be spelled either with the DR at the beginning or the word doctor, D-O-C-T-O-R. You can spell it that way as well. And if anybody wants to contact me during the programme, then please either use my website. I think we will probably try and take some calls maybe in the third hour. We'll see how we go on. And if you do call in, please make it relevant to what we've been talking about. We don't really want to go too far off into other things. As you're probably aware, many listeners to this show will be aware, actually thanks to Deanna primarily, Dr. Judy Wood has written a book called Where Did the Towers Go?, which still, 5 years after it was first became available, is the only forensic investigation into the events of 9/11, or some of the events anyway, which actually happened at the World Trade Center. And some of the evidence in this book was submitted in a court case in 2007 and the years following that. And people need to be aware of this information if they are to make sense of a lot of what is going on. And in fact, one of the things I want to talk about is the ongoing cover-up of 9/11, which even just today, for example, I've been trying to actually illustrate is still happening right before us on social media and places like this. And so people need to be aware of this and how this is working, and we're going to try and discuss some of that. And as Dr. Wood has pointed out, the book, none of it's been refuted. There's been many efforts to actually refute it, but none have actually come. They can't refute it because it's a set of evidence which shows what happened. So again, we'll probably talk about some of that. And once again, my website is checktheevidence.com. Dr. Judy Wood's websites are drjudywood.com and wheredidthetowersgo.com. I don't know if Dr. Wood wanted to say anything at this point. We're probably going to have a break any minute now because we have an early break. Dr. Wood, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can. Hello.
Yes, I just wondered if you wanted to say hello before, because I think we'll have a break after about 4 minutes or something, so I think we've probably got another minute. And, I mean, you'd brought up a couple of topics that we're probably going to discuss, fairly early on, because one of the things I want to go into probably after the first break is to talk about something called geoengineering. And it is often a word that is not used. Okay. Well, I'm getting a message here that we're not going to break until I think 1928. Okay, well, that will give me some time then. What I'll do is I'll ride with when the music comes in, and I'll see how I go on. Basically, I wanted to talk about geoengineering initially. What does this word mean? Well, essentially, it means engineering the environment, engineering the environment we live in. And essentially, the context in which this is meant is in engineering the weather. And this is a word which I would argue has entered the public's vocabulary. It's kind of been drip-fed into the public's vocabulary, I think, over about the last 6 years or so, maybe slightly longer. And I have certainly been to two what might be called public consultation meetings in Great Britain, run by the Royal Society, which is the oldest scientific society in the world. I think some of the original members included Sir Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke, the famous natural philosophers from the 1600s. And these, I think now, the public consultations were actually, to me, fairly meaningless, because they were part of the process of essentially brainwashing the public into this idea that carbon dioxide has had an effect on the climate, and that this carbon dioxide has been this carbon dioxide has been produced by human activity. And I think, although we could spend more than 3 hours going through why this is patent nonsense, and we would probably get, if this was a mainstream audience, we would get scientists ringing in to say that this was completely wrong and the science was settled, etc., etc. I think for me personally, I get extremely frustrated when people feel that they can have a conclusion about something when they ignore 50% or more of the available evidence, which proves that their conclusions must be wrong, or at least cannot be as conclusive as they would contend. So I'm going to basically start off until I get some music and maybe just read through for a few minutes something which I wrote in 2009 originally, and this was written in response to one of these aforementioned public consultation meetings at the Royal Society. And before I do that, I will just describe my experience there. And if you know where to look, you can hear me reading out a short address, I suppose you might say, which they almost didn't allow me to do when I was in this meeting, but it has fortunately been archived, in which I warned the people present, or I basically reminded them of a warning, I should say, that was given by President Eisenhower in 1961. And he warned in his speech about the military-industrial complex, and Dr. Wood and I have spoken about this before, how we could be held hostage to a scientific technological elite. And I think this phrase, scientific technological elite, is something that is that phrase that Eisenhower used is very rarely used and very rarely considered, in that what if these people that are setting stating all these things that are allegedly scientifically proven are not actually proven, and the examples of that, again, is 9/11, where they produced these technical reports, which were just basically totally incorrect. They were scientifically incorrect. Yet we have this elite, this scientific technological elite, that you might call it as Eisenhower did, that now says, well, that is the truth, get used to it, don't challenge it. Essentially, that's what it's saying. So I'll read something from this document that I wrote, and I've called the document Reinvestigating Climate Change. And as I say, this was written in response to a public consultation meeting, because they were asking for members of the public to submit their thoughts about the so-called climate change issue. So this is what I wrote in this document, which is about 20 pages long, and it's mainly pictures, actually. For much of the last 20 years, the debate about what is most affecting our climate has been raging. More recently, it seems, certain groups within mainstream science and academia have gained, quote, the upper hand, close quote, and the wider population appear to have accepted their flawed conclusions. These conclusions have then been used to set public policy in governments around the world. This has happened despite the repeated reports of a failure to agree various environmental targets at a number of so-called climate summits that have taken place over the last few years, such as the one in Kyoto, which I think was in 1992, and Copenhagen, which was later. I haven't got the dates for these right in front of me, but you can check these up. And I've referenced all of this in this document that I've produced. And so we have these climate summits. A troubling development in the last few years has been the open discussion of geoengineering, modifying the Earth's climate directly by one means or another. And then I talk about what I call catastrophism and the techniques of divide and conquer, and what I call the control group, which goes under many names. It seems to be true that if you tell people their way of life is under threat, and you present them with some vaguely plausible story as to how you know this is true, they will become easier to manipulate. They may question you about your conclusions, and if you can answer their questions in a credible way, you will gain their confidence and, as a consequence, gain power over them. This is this scientific technological elite to which Eisenhower referred. However, it seems that to really understand what is happening in climate science, one has to entertain that there is indeed an overall control group which has an agenda. That agenda is one of gaining increased power and control over the lives of ordinary people. With research and campaign groups polarized, it becomes much easier to hide the control group's identity and even hide the very idea of the control group's existence. The task of concealment is therefore assisted by a process of creating factions within the general populace who sit on either side of an issue and expend their energies arguing or even attacking each other. Whilst attention is focused on the squabbles, the control group can carry out its agenda, whilst most people are blind to the evidence which betrays the control group's reality. And in this document I reference Dr. Wood's study of Hurricane Erin as the clearest evidence of the reality of some kind of powerful control group of unknown identity is shown in that data, I would argue. Most people are also blind to the operation of the control group's tactics to hide their own existence and identity, and they're blind to the control group's ability to confuse or confound anyone trying to uncover more information about the control group itself. Some people become seduced by the wish for more power and influence, and then perhaps are unwittingly co-opted into the larger agenda. Some people feel, for reasons discussed later in the document, they are helping the Earth or the planet or the environment, or they are helping to create a positive future. So I'm trying to express here, people, want to end pollution, and they want to, create clean energy sources, and we have this phrase which has been used, sustainable living, and this has come out of something called Agenda 21. If you look into that. And then I want to talk about attitudes to those people like me. I do have some background in science and engineering, so I do have some knowledge of these things because of my own work in the past in these areas. Typically, when data like that shown in the document I'm referring to, which is called Reinvestigating Climate Change, and it's on my website, is or are brought up or discussed, there is a huge adverse reaction to that data, and a big fight ensues. And you can see a typical example of this from a few years ago in a TV interview with Ed Begley and Stuart Varney of Fox News, where Varney asks if the science about climate change is conclusive, and he challenges various statements made by Ed Begley. Begley states, "You're spewing your nonsense again." I wonder if some of this stems from what is discussed in section later in the document. So what I'm asking there is, people become attached to certain sets of data, and they will vigorously stick with that data even when it can be shown that that is incomplete, and there are other factors that must be taken into account. Similarly, what's been happening with this issue in the mainstream media, people who are not scientists have made widely read comments which do not address any of the data which I talk about. For example, Paul McCartney in an interview compares global warming skeptics, which is a label given by the mainstream media, to Holocaust deniers. So he's using an emotive argument to try and discredit those who present other data which proves that this CO2 business isn't the whole story. For those who are naturally sceptical, sniggers or cries of phrases such as conspiracy theory or tinfoil hat often serve to discourage renewed, reasoned and dispassionate analysis of the evidence. This, it seems, is an example of how group mentality can be influenced and moulded. You use these labels and attach them to people or groups to stop people looking at the actual evidence they're talking about. It should be borne in mind that finding the truth demands a most vigorous application of energy and time to investigate what is truly happening, and this investigation must take place with a clear and stated independence from corporate and other vested interests, and without recourse to either invective or preconceived notions. Now, a clear thing with the climate change issue is that we must be clear in distinguishing between environmental damage and climate change. There is no doubt that human activity is damaging the environment. For example, industrial pollution and industrialized fishing and agricultural practices have, it is clear, destroyed habitat. They've caused extinction of a number of species of flora and fauna in various ways and for various reasons. With the real damage caused on a daily and large-scale basis, it is easy to manipulate people's emotions, fears and environmental conscience when presenting these matters without proper distinction between environmental damage and climate change. In other words, just because we happen to, or companies, large companies, happen to be, drilling oil and creating pollution with various chemicals that are used in the environment, does not necessarily prove that that is affecting the climate. And also that applies to the production of CO2.
I'd like to insert an example, like in the Gulf of Mexico, the naturally occurring tar balls.
Yep.
That come out of the salt domes and other things that, in the Gulf. It gets confused with, polluting oil wells.
I think that's an extremely good example, because then the environmentalist will make an argument that the oil has destroyed the environment, and then the people that know about these tar balls will point out, no, in this particular instance, this is a natural thing that's
and there's a naturally occurring bacteria that eats the tar balls because it's been there for centuries and centuries.
And it's part of the ecosystem, in that area, and that's right. So people confuse these, and because it's an emotionally charged issue, they can't divorce themselves from the situation. They see all the dead fish, or things like dead dolphins, or horrible things like this, and
or even lightning strikes.
Yeah. Yeah,
that start fires where you need a fire to get more seedlings and for a turnover in the forest.
So it's easy to present emotive arguments by selectively using certain types of image, certain types of imagery, and this sort of thing. And you have to look at all of the evidence to get to the truth on matters such as this. And I just read on a little bit more from this. There's not much more. This is the introduction to this document. And the rest of it actually is mostly pictures. Most people have at least some awareness of the effects of their lifestyle on the environment, though these effects are often hidden, except when large numbers of people are affected by such things as dumping of industrial waste, depletion of fish stocks, or intensive farming practices. Is it any wonder that some websites promote the AGW myth, which means anthropic global warming, which is this idea that human activity generates CO2, which creates a warmer climate. They promote this idea out of love for the environment, but that's not a good basis on which to do it. You have to promote it on the basis of evidence. Also, we must make a distinction between local and global climate changes. For example, the urban heat island effect is well understood and the data is clear. The same conclusion by definition cannot apply on a global scale because an island is not a globe. And we'll talk to you after the break. Hello there. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I have with me on today's programme Dr. Judy Wood, and we're having a general discussion. Well, it's actually mainly me talking right now, but we're going to have a bit more of a discussion in a few minutes. And if you wanted to call in the final hour, there is a call-in number, and we'd like you to keep the questions tightly focused and perhaps discussing some of the issues we've been discussing tonight. And the call-in number is 1-800-313-9443. And you can visit our websites. Checktheevidence.com is my website, and Dr. Judy Wood's website is drjudywood.com, or you can look at the website for Dr. Judy Wood's book, Where Did the Towers Go?, which is wheredidthetowersgo.com, not surprisingly. And we've been talking about, well, I've been talking about something called geoengineering, which is related to so-called climate change. And I was talking before the break, I was reading from this document I'd written a few years ago called Reinvestigating Climate Change, and you can download that document from my website free. You know, I hope that you will do that, because I think I've tried to put quite a number of issues together in this into about it's actually, I got it wrong, it's actually 40 pages when you print it out in A5. It's if you print it out on letter size paper, it's about 20 pages, but it's mostly pictures. And I was talking about how there seems to be a hidden control group which is essentially trying to keep the idea of geoengineering, that's, you know, ongoing geoengineering, hidden, and they're wrapping this up in talk of climate change and having these opposing factions of the climate change groups and this sort of thing, and keeping the actual truth of what's going on hidden. And I wanted to just carry on reading a little bit more, not much more from this document. I talked about the urban heat island effect, for example. People know about that. That's been known about for, I think, decades, where this is where cities, for example, are maybe 1 or 2 degrees warmer than rural areas. The average temperature over a city will be, because, you know, you've got concrete structures and asphalt, which is absorbing the heat from the sun, and over a period of time, you know, you get this like storage heater effect, and that keeps the cities just 1 or 2, maybe a few more degrees warmer than the sort of rural areas. So that's well known. But people then want to extend that to the globe and say the globe is warming. Well, an island is not a globe, you know, that's simple as that. Nowadays, when some people suggest that changes in the weather are not caused by industrial pollution, it is assumed they are somehow suggesting we should not worry about the wholesale pollution of our environment. So this is the confusion between the global warming issue and the destruction of the environment. We have to separate those two issues. Or it is tacitly assumed that those suggesting other causes for changes in the climate are saying that humanity should not worry about the effects of its activities on the environment. And I'm not saying that. I think we should be very careful about all of the resources that we use. So because of the increase in visibility of environmental organisations and issues in the last 30 or 40 years, it becomes easier to marginalise legitimate scientific questions raised by people who remain sceptical or remain unconvinced that the carbon dioxide emissions, specifically from human industrial activity, have had any provable effect on global climate in the last 150 years. In other words, what I'm saying is, you show a few pictures of some chimneys belching out, you know, fumes and smoke, and you show, you know, some polluted lakes or something like that, and you can then immediately.
And then you tell people to connect the dots.
Yeah, you put some captions under it, or an article, or you write an article about how the global temperature measured by such and such a scale has gone up, and people believe it. Now, there is no doubt that carbon dioxide output has increased due to industrialisation. But in this document, and it's elsewhere, it's not just me that's done this, there's lots of research that shows this. You need to properly study the data, which proves that the climate change issue is much more complicated than is generally spoken of. And extra carbon dioxide from industrialisation is probably the least significant issue, and therefore the perfect disguise for any of the control group's agenda. And what you'll find is that when they talk of this global warming, by CO2, it's all based on modelling. It's not really based on observation, because even this idea of calculating the global temperature, it's hugely complicated. The way that you choose to average the data, you can change that. I'm sure
like
Dr. Wood has some comments on this.
Yeah, I'd like to insert something here. Is what you learn in elementary school when you start learning how to graph things. If you have two data points that are a nanometer apart, and you try to draw a straight line through them and extrapolate it 10 miles out, it's going to be real important as exactly what...
Hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I have with me Dr. Judy Wood, and we are currently sort of having a bit of a discussion, mainly me talking at the minute, from a document which I wrote called Reinvestigating Climate Change, and we're talking a little bit about that, and we're talking about geoengineering, which I'm going to try and get onto a little bit more shortly. And before the break, Dr. Wood was starting to talk about, because I'd made this point, that a lot of this global warming debate is based on modelling rather than observation, and I'd made this point that they talk about the average global temperature, and how you actually measure this is there are probably 500 different ways of averaging out the global temperature, and Dr. Wood was starting to make this point about the way that you draw a best fit line, I think, if I remember what she was saying correctly.
Yes, the simplest model is a straight line, and I think we all remember from elementary school drawing a straight line through two data points. If those data points are a nanometer apart, can you extrapolate it out 10 miles with any kind of reasonable, understanding? Also, how long have we been able to record temperatures to 0.0001 degrees Fahrenheit accuracy?
Absolutely, and that's... Yeah, absolutely. And
how long we had satellites that can tell us where there's a hurricane out in the middle of the ocean that we otherwise wouldn't see unless it made landfall.
Exactly, and I mean we know that the first satellite was Sputnik back in 1957, which of course was a very simple radio transmitter. That's all it was. I'm pretty sure it didn't have any sensing on it. So we know that the satellite records, for example, only go back to maybe the early 60s. Yeah, exactly, in our lifetime. I mean, there are the ground-based records, but they're very, very isolated. So we have to be aware that some of the claims being made by these scientists are not really based on a lot of measurement, and not as much as they would have us believe. And so I also have the question that with these CO2 measurements is that this CO2, the way that this is measured, how do they know which CO2 is produced by industrial processes and how much has come out of the inside of a volcano? Because when a volcano erupts, and you can look at the data for this, it emits an enormous amount of carbon dioxide, hundreds of years worth of equivalent to what factories would produce. If you added all the factories together on Earth, a couple of volcanic eruptions will produce more CO2 than all the factories on the Earth put together, in 50 or 100 years. So how do you distinguish between those two things? That's something that's not discussed. And when I went to this meeting in 2009, there was some young lady, she'd produced these graphs about her predictions for global temperature, and they went 3,000 years into the future.
So, again,
seriously.
drawing a straight line through data points that are a nanometer apart.
There you go. And these graphs, frankly, to me, look ridiculous. So we must be aware that whatever claims are made for this data, it is not supportable. It is not supportable. And I won't go through the rest of this document because I think it's much better if people want to read this, they read this themselves, because I cover a number of topics, including these so-called chemtrails that people have talked about. I talk about what are called chemtrails or persistent jet trails, which I've since done a lot more research on. But one thing I would like to mention, and I mentioned it to Dr. Wood briefly as we were talking before the program, is this so-called global warming and climate change which has been happening throughout the solar system. And a good chunk of the document, I show you the pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope and mainly the Hubble Space Telescope, actually, a couple of amateur pictures, where you can actually see changes in the climate on other planets way out in the solar system, which we know cannot have been caused by carbon dioxide from human activity.
Also, we know, the factory output and so forth of modern man. How did that cause the melting away from the Ice Age?
Exactly. I mean, there are other factors such as that. And then in the document I discuss the so-called Maunder minimum, and I mention the medieval warming period, which most of these scientists that talk about CO2-driven climate change don't talk about. They won't talk about that. And I think also, we should remind people about some of the data that you came across. I think it was back in 2008, which, I don't know if you would argue the way that I do, but I think this to me is clear evidence of something very fishy, which I would argue is an instance of geoengineering. And I think the fact that people will not talk about this.
I think the way, I look at it, the most simple, unassuming way is, hurricanes show up on weather maps. Why would they hide them? And don't they warn people when a hurricane's coming? If they don't know, if they can't predict the weather, as is the common thought, then they should tell people, well, maybe, this is voluntary evacuation right now. Let's wait and see how it gets closer before we have mandatory evacuation. But when they don't give that option at all, and you have the Category 3 hurricane headed straight to Manhattan, where you have, millions of people, you can't evacuate them in 1 hour's time. And nothing is said. That leads me to conclude that they have 100% control of that hurricane.
You are led to that conclusion, I think, and I would agree with you on that. I mean, one of the things that we cannot say is if it indeed was steered, which to me I think it must have been steered the way that if you look at the past, we don't know how that was done. We don't have the evidence to say how it was done. But if you look at what you just said right there, and other factors. They don't appear to have been worried. It appears that they didn't totally cover it up, but when we looked at the local news reports for that area that could have been affected by the hurricane, I sampled 4 news reports from the Internet Archive, and two of the news reports out of the 4 don't even mention Hurricane Erin, which is what we're talking about, which was this hurricane.
Not an icon on the weather map, and the weather's nice as can be.
Exactly, so well, as nice as can be. Yet this thing had actually, correct me if I'm wrong, been moving towards New York City in a straight line for 4 days prior to these reports going out on the TV.
Mm-hmm. And also the space station film from Frank Culberson.
That's right.
I'm looking down the East Coast, see if I see anything else. And I'm feeling sorry. You can see the what do you say, the carnage down there on the ground. This is the morning of 9/11 where he's saying this. And he doesn't notice that he has to aim his camera to avoid the bands of the hurricane. You'd think he'd say, well, gee, those people at least, it could have been worse, and they lucked out here.
Yeah, I mean, it's this odd expression, I'm looking up and down the East Coast to see if I can see anything else. Well, why would you be even looking for anything else if you're so concerned about what's happened in New York? And what would he expect to see from space? You can't see planes from space without high-powered optical equipment. So what would he expect to see? It's a curious turn of phrase that he uses. So
he probably couldn't see up and down the East Coast because the hurricane was so big he couldn't see through it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what really bugs me, and I'm a little bit irked because somebody on Facebook that I've corresponded with a few times, and I actually chatted to him on Skype for a couple of hours, probably 2 or 3 years ago now. And he is a chap called Max Bliss, and we talked about some of this, and we talked about Hurricane Erin, and how, you know, it does seem to have some correspondence with the events of 9/11, which some of that information is in fact probably most of it is covered in Dr. Wood's book, so that people can make their own judgment on you know, how it was involved, and see how it was involved, or see how it appears to have been involved.
Phenomenal coincidence.
Yeah, exactly. Or a phenomenal coincidence. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this Max Bliss character, you know, talks all about, you know, chemtrails and these other instances of geoengineering and so forth. Doesn't talk about Hurricane Erin. And yet I've seen him recently in the last couple of days. He's posted 2 9/11 videos. The latest one that he posted today included this Stephen E. Jones character who's set up this thermite disinformation back in 2005. Which I was suckered into. So why do... You know, this is my question. Why do people who talk about 9/11 not talk about Hurricane Erin? Why do people who talk about geoengineering not even consider that Hurricane Erin could be one of the strongest you know, bits of evidence that geoengineering was done as part of the operation of 9/11? Why do they not talk about it?
It definitely, you know, would imply foreknowledge if that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and people do not talk about this. And Dr. Wood and myself and Richard D. Hall, our good friend who's done all the TV programs with us and has been very key, very sort of, he's been a key person in raising the awareness of some of what I'm telling you, is Richard D. Hall in the UK. Oh, who else talks about this? Almost nobody.
Andrew, I think you came up with the exact reason. You know, thou shalt not combine.
Yes.
You don't want people to make connections as long as you keep people on single issues and they don't connect things.
That appears to be exactly what is going on, that you keep people focused on 1 or 2 issues and then you don't get this kind of more integrated picture. And
because that requires thinking, and people start seeing what's happening. They start being able to see more and more if they give themselves permission to see how things are interrelated.
Yes, and what I'm going to go on to talk about is how this knowledge begins to affect you and what effects it can have on you. And I've got some quotes from other people which I've been talking to over the last few years, which I'm also going to read out, because some of them I think are quite significant in what this means for all of us. Because geoengineering, why I want to bring this up, is it's not talked about that much, but it is an issue which transcends everything. It affects everybody on the planet. It affects all life on the planet. It affects life in the sea. It's not like, you know, it's not like money. It's not like politics. It affects everything. It affects the way that we live. It affects the way that we can grow food. It affects everything. And I think the technology involved, I would argue, affects the way that we can generate energy, and even affects, for example, the way that we could use it for propulsion and travel away from the Earth, and all of that comes into it.
I'd like to add one more thing to something you said earlier about getting people to fight about things. One of the biggest problems is keeping people away from, you know, developing their problem-solving skills. And one of the biggest things I emphasize with 9/11 is you first determine what happened before you talk about how it happened. You have to determine what it is that happened. And if you get people to focus on how it happened, they have to assume what it was. So you have a variety of assumptions, and the real problem never gets solved. So you have people arguing about their assumptions.
Exactly.
And I think that works with everything.
It does, and I think the global warming issue is one of the biggest current examples in the scientific community of that process, you know, going on, and has been going on for 20 years.
Because they feed you, you know, how before they tell you, before you understand what the problem actually is.
And I mean, I remember, for example, you know, going into some of this particular issue a little bit, this Climate Gate, as it was called, and this Hadley Climate Research Unit, which is based at the University of East Anglia in the UK, they've admitted science fraud. They've admitted massaging the data to fit their model. That was admitted, and it was admitted in emails which were leaked around the time of the Copenhagen summit in 2009. And one of the people that covered that was a fellow called James Corbett, who has become one of these alternative news reporters, and he even covered this Climate Gate number 2, as he called it. I don't know if that was his name or somebody else's, but this was the issue that they have this famous hockey stick graph, which is allegedly showing the increase in global temperature because of the increase in CO2. But it later transpired that they model, or the equations that they used to generate this graph, you could put any data into that equation, and it would generate this hockey stick shape. That was what was allegedly said later on, and this became public knowledge that this hockey stick was meaningless, and James Corbett made big fanfare of this. But James Corbett, again, will not talk about 9/11. He publicly has ridiculed the research of my co-host, Dr. Judy Wood, and you can see that on his website. So why would he do that? Why would he do that? When he's talking, and he's obviously done a lot of research into the climate issue, and he's also done research into the events of 9/11 and has spoken. He even made like one of these 10-minute bullet point videos about 9/11. Why would he not talk about this? Well, I know the answer to that, or I know the result of him not talking about it, and that's it. He's become part of the cover-up of the events of 9/11. So, also...
I wonder if you don't become part of the cover-up, do you get wiped off the map?
Well, this is the question: why do people become part of the cover-up? And we can talk about the reasons for that probably most of the rest of the program. But I think it's a mixture of reasons. But in this document, the document that I call Reinvestigating Climate Change, I talk about the fraud in the anthropic global warming group, and then, for example, I mention that's Dr. Judy Wood's Hurricane Erin study. You see the pictures of that. You'll see the pictures from around the solar system. You'll also see the pictures of various weather anomalies, which are just a few, and I've gathered probably quite a few more since. And I've been seeing those here quite recently, just in the last couple of days. I've seen, for example, clouds going across in an exactly east-west direction with a linear straight-edge ruler sort of appearance, and you can find videos of this on YouTube from around the world. You can find these strange hole punch clouds. Go and look for these. They're very little discussed in this context. And we've got a break coming up now, so we'll speak to you again after that. Okay, just had a slight problem with my headset. Just had to get that sorted out. Can you hear me now? Yes. Hello. Good evening. We wherever you are around the world, I'm just a little bit caught on the hop there because I had a slight problem with my headset. And my name is Andrew Johnson, as you probably now know. And we are here with Dr. Judy Wood. We've got a very short segment now, just a couple of minutes before we have yet another break. And we were talking about the 9/11 and the cover-up. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because I've had some feedback on how people feel when they realise the extent of the cover-up, and they also realise what actually happened at the World Trade Center, which is I can't really overstate, I should say, the significance of what happened there and the enormous world-changing significance of what actually happened there and what's revealed in Dr. Wood's book. Now, I I think one of the things that comes up as well is that, you know, we sometimes get people writing to us and making sort of various critical comments, or, you know, saying, oh, I like your theory, or I like your view, or this, that, and the rest of it. Or they'll say other things, and say, have you thought of this, or have you thought of that? And then we ask them about their background. Or this has certainly happened in my case a few times. You ask them about their background and why they might be asking these questions and why they're not grasping what the evidence shows, and they become quite defensive, and they may even sort of chastise you for asking about such things. I had one like this the other day on a related topic, and I wanted to point out that both myself and Dr. Wood, we've essentially become public figures. Not in the sense of, you know, sort of these regular mainstream scientists or celebrities or anything like that, but we have enough videos of ourselves and interviews and audios of ourselves on the internet, and of course this is now being added to that collection. This will now be added to that collection, that people should be able to get an impression of what we are like as people, at least to some extent, from listening to those interviews, and they should be able to work out fairly well, I think, if they study enough, you know, what we're actually saying, whether it's true or not, and whether we are sincere. And I know this might sound like I'm rambling a bit, and perhaps I am, but I want to talk more about this after the next break, because I want to make a point to some of these people that approach us mainly anonymously. So we'll speak to you after the next break.
You are tuned in to the Republic Broadcasting Network. Visit our website by going to republicbroadcasting.org.
Okay, so good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I have a website called checktheevidence.com. You can contact me through that website if you wish. I have with me Dr. Judy Wood, and she has a website called drjudywood.com. We are currently filling in for Diana Spingola, who has kindly offered us this slot as she is otherwise engaged today. And we're talking about the 9/11 cover-up, and I've pointed out that myself and Dr. Wood, we've essentially become public figures talking about this issue, and we then encounter a number of kind of sort of logistical problems when people write to us or try and talk to us, and for example, they will characterize what Dr. Wood has written or posted or, you know, put into a public presentation as a view or an opinion, when it is no such thing. It's actually a set of evidence. And, you know, sometimes when we try and point this out to people, they either don't seem to understand, or they will disagree with this. In other words, it's not a point of view, going back to what I said earlier about whether the towers turn to dust or not. It's actually an observation. And people should understand that. They need to understand that difference. And also, following on from that, you know, we have to point out some of our own experience. Dr. Wood is a scientist. She has been involved for literally decades in scientific research in her field of expertise. And I think before, you know, I'll get Dr. Wood to comment on this, but what I wanted to point out is that in the age of the internet, that somehow now becomes devalued, because people think they can thoroughly know about a topic just by maybe watching a couple of YouTube videos, or, you know, reading a couple of Wikipedia pages or whatever. But that of course doesn't count the same in the same way as having decades of research experience. For myself, it's slightly different. I don't have decades of scientific research experience, but I do have decades of experience of work in an engineering discipline, which involves technical analysis and gathering information to solve problems. That's been my background for a total period of about just over 20 years. So I have that experience. I have the experience of actually taking information, breaking it apart, finding the errors in it, fixing it back up again to fix a problem. Dr. Wood, in her own areas of expertise, has had to do that sort of thing to solve various problems, to research. In her own area of expertise, she's had to make things, she's had to build things, she's had to re-engineer things to make them work the way that she's needed them to work to complete her research tasks.
Or to understand, what it is you're looking at, and you keep, researching it until you figure it out.
So I just wanted to make a couple of points quickly that is not the same as watching a YouTube video. You develop an innate understanding, and you can even develop an intuition for whether something is going to be worth looking at or worth studying more, and this sort of thing. So you have all that experience, and that cannot be overridden just by a couple of emails and a couple of watching a couple of YouTube videos, and we are publicly recognised for that. And some of these people that contact us will say, what research have you done? Have you published it on a website? Have you taken it to court? And then, of course, the silence that comes back is usually pretty comprehensive silence on those sorts of issues. But just before I'm sure Dr. Wood will have many comments on this, but I just wanted to make the point that we've now reached a situation where, because of things like, I've talked a lot earlier on about the climate change issue, that is an area where many people now no longer trust, and rightfully so in that particular case, much of what the scientific community puts out, because what they put out is not really scientific research, it's propaganda. So this presents people like us with a problem, because they can get into the situation where, you've got a PhD, well, we don't trust you because you've been brainwashed by the scientific establishment. So we've got a double-edged sword with this here. And so anyway, I've said what I wanted to say, and Dr. Wood, I think, wants to follow up with some comments.
Something along the same lines, that I was contacted by a reporter, whatever happened to investigative journalism, a reporter who wanted to do a video about the cover-up. So why talk about the cover-up? You talk about what actually happened that is knowable. And, there are facts. And, that's just your views. We want to talk about your views as well as other views. Well, if you talk about a gazillion views, it does absolutely nothing for the audience. 2 plus 3 is 7, 2 plus 3 is 9, somebody else says 2 plus 3 is 5, somebody else says 2 plus 3 is 8. I guess we'll never know what 2 plus 3 is. There's just no consensus. That's what gets presented to the audience. And it's an injustice. But what really it comes down to is this person does not have degrees in civil engineering, engineering mechanics, materials engineering science, doesn't have 40 years experience in forensic engineering and science, has not researched this project for over 10 years, hasn't even read the report.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem, really, that you have to look at the evidence, and you have to look at it in from a context of knowing, for example, in your case, knowing how materials behave. You knew how those materials should behave in those circumstances, because, those were things that you taught classes about, But
I'm also used to observing, and I see a material coming apart into dust. I mean, it jumps out at you. Other people would look at it and say, well, I know this, and this. It doesn't fit in those, it must be one of those categories, so therefore it's a collapse because that's all I know exists. Instead, I look at what is the material doing, and I can see what it's doing. I don't have to have the explanation as to why, but I can see it's turning into dust in midair.
And absolutely, and you illustrated that to me, years ago now, and I'd never originally seen that. Despite I have a knowledge of physics and so forth, but I didn't have that detailed knowledge, probably, of how to observe things in the physical, in a physical sense, in that sort of environment. It's not something I'd actually done very much of, certainly not as much as you had. So you educated me in that regard. And I think this is one of the issues. People have to be willing to be educated. They have to be willing to learn.
Exactly.
And that requires something I haven't mentioned. That requires a type of humility. And humility is not a quality which is available, or not available, that's the wrong word, but I don't think it's seen widely enough. Not many people have humility. It's also a word which is not used very much. We're often taught to be adversarial, and we're taught to be confrontational, but rarely do we see examples of humility, and sort of because, for example, politicians, if they were to say, "Oh, sorry, I got that wrong," and I need to change what I said because it was wrong, that's seen as a sign of weakness, to not vote for that person.
And that soundbite would be played and played and played over and over again by their opposition.
Yeah, and we have this idea of a U-turn and stuff like that, but unless you're willing to learn, and we know that most of the people in the world are mistaken about what they understand happened on 9/11. We know that because we know what happened, and that yet then again you get into this idea that we're accused of being arrogant because we say no, that we know what happened. Well, it's not really arrogant to say that you've studied something. It's not really arrogant for a police investigator to say, well, I know how this person was killed because I've investigated it. It's their job. It's what they've been tasked with doing. And although we haven't been given this as a job, we've taken it upon ourselves essentially as a public, as a job, as a service to the public, And so we do have some expertise. I don't have the same expertise as you, but hopefully I have expertise in at least, communicating some of this information at the very least to other people, because that's been some of what I've done. So this is what people have to consider. And when we get attacked by anonymous people that don't have qualifications, or if they do, they're unwilling to disclose what they are, and they're not willing to disclose what problem they're trying to solve. This is a common one we ask people as well. If you say this is wrong, and you come out and say this is just an opinion, well, what problem are you trying to solve? Do you want to actually know what happened? Do you know how do you think you know what happened? What do you think happened?
Yeah, do you even want to solve the problem?
Do you even want to solve the problem?
Reporter. The reporter has the choice now. They could read the report if they want to know what happened. But if they don't want to know what happened, they won't.
No, and have they even defined the problem that they're trying to solve? In other words, are they going to look at what happened to the World Trade Center, or are they going to try and look at the events at the other sites on 9/11? That some people don't even think about that.
They just want ratings.
They just want ratings, or Facebook likes, or YouTube views, or to sell books or whatever it is. Essentially, the thing about you and I is we're both have been involved in education. I'm still on a sort of low level involved in education part-time. So, one of my part-time jobs as a tutor, I try and, I'm supposed to explain things to my students and get them to understand. And that's exactly the same approach that I adopt when somebody writes to me. If they're genuine with their inquiry, I will try and illustrate to them, an answer, their question. But other people apparently are not like that. We do have this huge cover-up ongoing, and it is being operated by evil forces. I think that's something that you come to realize, and it uses various tactics, up to and including mind control. And
naive people don't realize when they're being manipulated. They're given a list of talking points that they repeat and repeat without even paying attention to what the talking points are. My favorite one was it got repeated over and over again, and initially by Stephen Jones, saying that there were steel-toed boots that were melting. until I started saying, wait a minute, if my steel oven is melting, the turkey inside is more than well done. Yet we have no reports of burned feet. But that line had been repeated in an amazing amount of time, just like all the steel was shipped to China. In 5 minutes.
That's it, and it's a simple technique for training people, is just by hourly repetition of a statement, like climate change or global warming or, whatever it is. People become hypnotized.
There must be truth to it if somebody's saying it.
It must be true. If you have some, professor on TV talking about climate change, then what he's saying must be true. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying. But I think, again, I'd like to read out a couple of messages I've received, not recently, but I just thought I'd put into this program we were doing today. And I think when you realize the truth about what happened at the World Trade Center, and it kind of sinks in, and this can take actually a period of time, up to a couple of years, I think, to really...
I'd like to insert one thing here. Is, a lot of people want to know when I'm going to have an electronic version of my book. I'm not, because there's something special about having it in your hands. You sit on the sofa and you read a paragraph, and then you look out in the space and you contemplate on what you just read. Plus, you don't have anyone to save face to. When somebody reads online, they tend to scan, or electronically, and they do data mining or whatever with word searching, and just read one little segment instead of understanding the whole story. But the idea of holding a book in your hand, being able to think about and contemplate what you're reading is so important.
Yes, and I think there are, that's absolutely right, and I think there are a number of other reasons why an e-book wouldn't really work as well, and it's also much easier to kind of hack it and change it and kind of release a fraudulent version or a doctored version or something, and it may be done in very subtle ways. This is something that I've written a little bit about in a slightly different context, that I've encountered related to 9/11 research, though. But I just this idea of actually realizing the truth and knowing what's going on. I spoke about this to somebody else, and it's kind of, when you realize this, you're thrown into a different place, and it's like there's this wall between you and other people. And Claudia, a lady, wrote to me, and she said that this was exactly her experience following reading a book by Rosalie Bertell, where she came to the conclusion that, for example, the earthquake in Haiti, I haven't come to this conclusion myself, but she really felt that this was deliberately caused, the earthquake in Haiti, and there are some peculiar effects around that. But she said that since then, and this is how I felt, since then, and since my realization of what happened at the World Trade Center and how it was done with the energy weapon, I have been living beyond the barrier and cannot be heard or understood by anyone on the normal side, the other side of the barrier. The change happened like an earthquake within my body. I fell ill. When I got up, everything had changed. It was like a call from the spiritual world, she said. This is Claudia's words, not mine. The Earth herself also. This is why I founded the Planetary Movement for Mother Earth. She felt that there was something going on with this, planetary consciousness. And I think there's something along those lines going on too, but I'm not going to go into that here. I thought it could be the means to move other people over the barrier as well, and it is my experience as well that I failed in trying to do so until now. And so she's talking about this, you end up in this place where you can't communicate with other people any longer because you know things that they can't appreciate, they can't get to. And then Atahan is one of the members of the Facebook group that we post on called Real 9/11 Truth. He'd written a similar theme, and he said that you want to bring your loved ones with you, but you can't. And this is, I think that's a very simple statement, but in many cases it's true. A lot of my family have no clue about the significance of this, and I can't really seem to get it across to them. Because when you get passionate about something and you try to kind of, convey how important this is, it puts people off. They cannot go there, and I think it was...
Or more than that, they have to be ready to go there, because they start going that direction, and they see the implications, and they can't handle it, and they're scared to death, and they run the other direction, and are afraid to death of getting near that wall. And they have to be ready to get there. And if they're not, there's nothing much you can do, I think.
And going on back to what Claudia was saying, she writes, an argument against the journey is this: what would people do with the knowledge, as they cannot do anything against the perpetrators? In other words, what do we do against these people with this technology? Who knows? Only when being clear about the reality can we start to think and act properly. Without that, we would always be behind, hopelessly lost in confusion. So this is, I think, one of the key things. We're still at this realization stage, and one of the things I wanted to say earlier, but didn't, was going to just mention about the JFK assassination. The problem, as I see it, for example, is if we look at the JFK assassination, we know that this story of Oswald isn't true, and I'll perhaps, if I have time, mention a little bit more about what I've read recently, but that official story has essentially lasted 50 years. No one really, apart from, I think, Clay Shaw, has ever been charged with any crimes in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy, and he was one of the most powerful men in the world. He, in other words, was probably not a member of this elite group. He was somehow outside of it. And what did they do? They killed him. So people have to realize what the enemy is capable of, and somehow we've got to, I don't know how we do it, but we have to be able to transcend that situation.
It also, the objective is not revenge. It isn't about getting someone, because if you get the person who pushed the button to operate it, there's another one waiting to sit down and operate the machinery too.
So that seems to be the case. If the technology exists, that's the issue. You know, you can have any number of operators. Yes. And then I had another little quote from Etahan, who said that you experience a kind of sorrow as you watch others get their psychology operated on, and all you can do is watch. You can't seem to show them and illustrate to them what's happening, because they're not receptive or not able to receive what you're saying. Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Andrew Johnson, and I have with me Dr. Judy Wood. We are just filling in for a few more minutes now for Diana Spingola, who will be back on her next program. She's otherwise engaged today, so we were asked to fill in for Diana, and she will be back next time. So I just started to read. I was a little caught out with the timing. And I was talking about the cover-up of 9/11 and how, one can feel when one realizes what the truth is. And we have a Facebook group called 9/11 Real Truth, and a number of people in there have expressed their, angst about not being able to communicate this knowledge to other people and its significance. And Atahan, who's a member of that group, he actually said to me in one message that he described knowing this truth, knowing that there is this technology which is real, that it's an immaculate burden. And I think this is an interesting phrase that he's used, in that we know the truth, but it is kind of a burden to know it as well. And so I just wanted to make that point.